One. Greetings, everyone. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another episode of Friday Morning at the Funhouse 2025 style, alongside Mr. Martin Popoff. What's going on, my
Yes,
friend?
morning, sir. Ready to go. Ready to attack this new year.
That's
Excellent.
right. And we're attacking the new year, our first episode of 2025, with a very cool topic here on this very chilly Friday morning in the Hudson Valley. Winter is
Supposed to get
back.
very cold over the next few days.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We had that little weirdness of like low mid 50s for a couple of days, and we're like, Where'd this come from?" And now it's winter's roaring back with a vengeance, which, it is January.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
should.
for sure.
So we've got a really interesting topic today that when Martin first brought it to my attention about a week or so ago, at first I was kind of like, all right, this sounds like a challenging one. Let me think about what I can find. And then once I started thinking about it and started thinking about it, all of a sudden, all the different picks and examples came to light, and I could have done twice as many picks as we agreed on. So the whole idea here behind today's show is about bands or artists that took a risk with an album. They experimented with their sound, maybe changed their sound, maybe used a producer that was drastically different who they used before, that maybe kind of changed things up a little bit, whatever, used different types of technology, maybe experimented with the lineup, whatever. But they took a risk with this album. And with that risk, we found that it really, really worked in this example for today, for today's episode. These risks, that experimenting that they did, worked out in a really good way. And we've picked 10. I have way more than 10, so I've got some honorable mentions today. I was trying to figure out which 10 to pick here, Martin, and I was like, because I kept adding to the list and adding to the list. And I'm like, well, here's another great example. So, what was really cool about this today is I think hopefully we have an excuse to talk about some different albums for once here, because Martin and I always get kind of frustrated that we wind up talking about the same albums all the time. I think there's some examples here today of maybe bands and artists that we don't slot in all the time. But Martin, you want to kind of expand on this topic, because I think it's a really, really good one.
Yeah, I know I didn't explain it too fully, and not all of mine are took a risk with an album. It's a little bit wider, but I'm looking at my list here, and most of them kind of fit that exact premise. But yeah, I think we're going to get a little bit of a good variety here, like different ways people take risks and when it pays off. And yeah, who knows? I mean, maybe perhaps the next show we can say when it didn't kind
But
of.
it did work, yeah, yeah.
And yeah, so it was hard to kind of and I wanted to sort of make this that it definitely has to work, but but there's different ways of making it work. It's like for your life goals, for creativity, commercially, how did it work, kind of thing. Did it make you cooler? Or that kind of thing, right? So there's different ways of making it work. So yeah, I've got 10, and we also didn't compare a list, so we may have some overlap here, right?
Yep, yep. That's another reason
Um,
why I picked extra, because I was like, there might be a few of these where we kind of overlap. So yeah.
yeah. So do you want to go three, then four? You want
Yeah,
to do it
that's
that
fine.
way? Okay, all right. So my first choice is Kevin Moore and Chroma Key. I love the idea. I think this is one of the best examples of somebody who leaves a good situation. He takes a risk and leaves Dream Theater, and comes up with this really, really interesting band that I think he can go into his sunset years and say, this is the coolest thing I ever did. I really do think Graveyard Mountain Home is one of the masterpieces of all time by anybody. And then I love what he does with OSI as well. So I just think that's kind of one of those situations of someone taking a risk and saying, I have to have a better canon of work behind me when I die. When I'm done with all this, I want to have something I'm even way more proud of, sort of thing. And so I think that guy is an absolute musical genius, and he can say that he's done these amazing works. And I've often said that was pretty cool that Steve Hackett goes and does what he does, because now when Steve Hackett gets together with the Genesis guys, he can look at his catalog and say, you know what, Phil, I think I did better than you. Peter Gabriel might be able to say the same thing. and Phil's the one who stayed in the band, sort of thing. So, and you know, I think of Howard Devoto leaving the Buzzcocks and going on to do Magazine, which is amazing. You know, Izzy Stradlin leaving Guns N' Roses. I don't know if that particularly applies, but I think you could say creatively, if you're a Guns N' Roses fan, you look at Izzy and say that guy's pretty cool for having done that, and the great, you know, and the massive catalog that he comes up with. And people will often say there's kind of a cool Stonesy, interesting integrity to that catalog. That's maybe even better than the Guns N' Roses catalog, because people always put down the Guns N' Roses catalog of being too short, right? They didn't do enough work over the years, sort of thing. So that's my first one. My second one also doesn't really fit in the album category, but it's more or less, we could talk about Twisted Sister in the way that they took a risk early in their career and said, let's build this whole thing up locally and spend a lot of money and rent out halls ourselves and promote it and have these shows. And you know, the blame, the losses will all be on us, but so will the profits if we do this. And they became an absolute, you know, massive local legend. They made a lot of money without having to go on tour in a big way, as that band who existed from basically 73, 74 all the way up to the first album, which I think Under the Blade is 81. But yeah, an incredible album as well. So I thought that was cool. And then a similar idea is this idea of how Triumph decided they were never going to be a support band. So pouring all your money into, you know, taking on the risk for the reward, and then also a corollary sort of thing is taking all your money, pouring it back into the show, and just going out there with a lot of chutzpah and saying, I'm a headliner, even though you don't really, you know, even though you really don't think, you know, you're, or you know, the world hasn't told you you're a headliner yet. You're going to tell the world you're a headliner, and
And
just go out and do
it
that.
worked for Triumph, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I never even really thought about that because they headlined from day one here in the States,
Yeah.
never opened for anybody,
And
and
buying all those lights and everything. And I
yeah,
told you the
it
story.
was a experience, and I mean, I saw Triumph in some really big places. I saw Triumph in 20,000 seaters numerous times, and they weren't. It's not like they were even really. When you look at their album sales, did it really match up with what they were selling out there on the road? I don't think so. I mean, they had some fairly big-ish albums, but they were never selling like 3 million, 4 million copies of anything, right? But they
Yeah.
went out and toured as if they were, and people were
Yeah, and that
going.
show is literally serving the function of a really great PR agent. It's like you know, you're a kid watching that show and you think these guys are musical titans, right?
Yeah,
And
they're
on
huge.
top of the
Yeah,
world with their little light bulbs all lining the stage and stuff,
yeah.
which I told you the story of John Waite kicking them out. You know, he can be a surly guy, that guy, right? But he probably didn't get along with the crew, or the band was snobby to him or something. But
Yeah.
he's like playing live, you know, before them kicking out their light bulbs and stuff. So, okay, my third one is onto the album thing, and I made a promise to myself not to really make this about London Calling, to put you in a bad mood this morning. So I just went the next record forward, Combat Rock. So the idea here is that this is a band absolutely growing by leaps and bounds, rapidly changing their sound, taking a huge risk every time they do it. The first album's pretty punky. The second album's pretty punky, but they get some stick for it being almost too riffy and heavy. And the songs are longer and they're better arrangements. And then London Calling comes along, and there's nothing heavy on it at all. It's not punky at all. And then they're just immersing themselves in dub and you know, the original versions of hip hop and all these crazy quirky sounds and atmospherics. And so they take a huge risk. Sorry, in between their Sandinista as well, which is not that much of a risk. Sandinista is a transitional album to this. But the funny thing is, so they make this very uncommercial album, and oddly, it becomes their biggest selling album, because they've got Should I Stay or Should I Go on it, and Rock the Casbah. Now, Should I Stay or Should I Go is pretty conservative as a song. But Rock the Casbah is as crazy as everything else on this album, and just really into that whole, like I say, moving forward, rapid, you know, New York urban scene, London urban scene, Jamaican dub, all that sort of stuff. Major sound collages. So they are taking risks all the time and moving forward. They're restless. They don't want to stand still, and things can fail. This is not a very commercial album. It just happened to have two hits on it. And the hits are kind of novelty songs because everything's kind of novelty on here. So that one I think kind of fits the thing. That is my first three.
Cool. Good stuff. All right. So some of my picks, a few of them, I think are examples of bands taking a risk that maybe at the time wasn't a commercial success, but I think with the masses, but I think that with critics and now looking back historically speaking, the risk was worth the rewards. And I think these albums are looked at fairly fondly now, all these years later, for their experimentation and then the fact that the band went and did something completely different. My first choice today is Extreme, Three Sides to Every Story. Big risk, right? Because I think the band with their first album and certainly with Porno Graffiti had a winning formula that people really liked. You know, you had the big ballad on the second album, and maybe the band unjustly lumped in with a lot of the hair or glam metal bands in that whole scene. And I think with this album, they decided they wanted to do something completely different. They did a concept album separated into three different parts. Each part had songs of a certain type of style of music. Each one was very different from the other. I think this album really confused the general public who maybe just wanted, well, let's get more than words and, let's get more of that whole funky metal thing. And you get a little bit of that here. But this definitely shows a band growing leaps and bounds musically, songwriting wise, right? And doing a very, very adventurous collection of music that probably went over the heads of a lot of people at the time, but now looking back, many people cite this as their absolute masterpiece. And they never really did anything like this again. And in the years since, we've seen, very little output from them over the years. But they did come back fairly recently, was it last year, 2023, 2 years ago now, with an album that maybe kind of hints at a lot of the stuff they were doing on this. So I think as a risk, maybe didn't really work out for them at the time, but like I said, historically speaking, I think they probably feel pretty proud about this album and the legacy that it's kind of created since then. So that's my first choice. Kind of in a similar way, here's another example of an album at the time that maybe wasn't received all that well. This is a band who probably, before they released this album, said, we don't need to release any more studio records. Nobody's buying new records from older bands. We can just go out and tour and play the hits and play all the stuff from our deep catalog. But they decided, no, we're going to do a new album and we're going to do what we want to do, and that is Eclipse by Journey. And instead of doing just another typical Journey album, three or four ballads, some real commercial stuff, a couple hard rockers, they do an album that's really heavy. It's really guitar oriented. Maybe this was mostly coming from Neil Schon. Lots of heavy rockers on here. You can even call part of this album metal. Yeah, there are a couple ballads on here. It didn't really sell all that well. Initially, it did, but then people were kind of like, oh, that's not the Journey I want. Where's all the hits on this album? Because it really wasn't that kind of album. But looking back, I think this was a true triumph for them because it showed that they could go out, put some really good songs together on a new album, do something a little bit differently. Kevin Shirley produced it. It's this great sounding album. And I think, unfortunately, it came out at a time where a band like this, most people who are fans of Journey, they want to hear the hits, probably ignored this. But I think if you go back and give this a shot, this is a triumph of an album. The songs are heavy, they're rocking, they're guitar oriented, but they're really memorable, just like any Journey album is and any Journey song is. So that's my second choice. And my third choice is a band who were moving into a new decade, because this was 1991, so it's the beginning of a new decade. The music's changing, the world's changing. They probably needed to change their sound a little bit to kind of do something a little bit different. The band is Sabotage Streets, a rock opera. So again, let's do a concept album in 1991. Kind of a strange choice. But going into the 90s, are albums like Hall the Mountain King and Sirens and all that stuff, is that really going to succeed in the early 90s with so much changing? The Seattle scene is bursting, got alternative music right around the corner. And I think this was a risk that still resonated enough with classic hardcore Sabotage fans, but it opened up their music to lots of new listeners because it was much, much more theatrical, musical, melodic, maybe not quite as heavy, not quite as whatever you want to call Savage's earlier music, power US power metal, classic metal, whatever you want to call it, right? This kind of hard to describe their music. And this, I think, opened the door for every album to follow, and certainly proved to be what paved the way for the Trans-Siberian Orchestra, because I think all of the real kind of Broadway theatrical rock that they were doing starting on this album and future albums, we wouldn't have TSO if it wasn't for this. I think if they did another Hall of the Mountain King album and another one like that after that, would we have ever gotten TSO? Maybe not. So, yeah, that's my first three picks for today.
Wicked, nice, nice. Okay, my next pick is it's a little bit along the Clash lines, and the theme is kind of the same, but it's Boomtown Rats with Tonic for the Troops. I was shocked when this album came out because the first album is good, well recorded, heavy punk. The first album was actually produced by Mutt Lange, and so is this. But it's the whole idea of these bands. That were punk, and a whole bunch of them did this. And I did a whole History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff audio podcast episode on this, you know, outlining all the different bands that went super creative and new wave after punk. It just proves that Bob Geldof is one of these guys that's who is in it for the right reasons, as was the rest of the band in terms of we've got this organization set up. We're a bunch of creative guys. We're going to pursue creativity, even though we might get some heck for it, kind of thing. Rat Trap was a bit of a hit. It leaned that way. Eventually, you get The Fine Art of Surfacing. I don't like Mondays. I mean, I think Fine Art of Surfacing is a masterpiece of an album, one of my favorite albums of all time. That went gold in the UK, platinum in Canada. The debut went gold in the UK. This went platinum in the UK. But yeah, I mean, moving to that sort of look is just so not punk. And they started as more or less a punk band. And this is not a heavy album at all, but there's just a lot of interesting stuff on it. So I think a lot of those punk bands took a risk. I mean, was it a risk? I don't know. Or were I think of Extreme a little bit like this as well. I mean, were you kind of there's an element of you had no choice, where a previous thing is dying on the vine and you're being kicked out of that genre anyways. And you could have the debate that punk was dead and you had to get out even to survive, which is a cynical way of looking at it. But I just appreciate all these bands that went really interesting and changed with the times. Adverts is another one. People just put down the adverts for that second Cast of Thousands album. I love it to death. So there were a lot of these bands that kind of did that. My next one, bit of a weird one, is the Sabbath Bloody Sabbath album cover. I think this is Warner Brothers taking a risk. I think Sabbath just made really cool, interesting, risky music all through that whole period. But I can't pick a particular album that is them taking a risk. That was the other cool thing about this episode. I went through a lot of bands and realized there's a lot of bands who never really took much of a risk with anything. Right?
True.
So yeah, I had to discount a lot of bands and most of what they did in their catalog. But I just still, as I've always said, I have a whole chapter on this album cover in a Black Sabbath book I did called Black Sabbath FAQ. And I just shake my head how Warner Brothers got away with that. And
Yeah.
how the risk kind of pays off in that. I mean, they how did they even get this on the streets, given what is there? And how did they just not get like absolutely drummed out of town with pitchforks by the evangelist right kind of thing? And how is it just not banned? And then over time, it becomes an album cover. It's funny. I came up with this one because I've seen so many videos of people who do YouTube shows and stuff where like this, they've got, who is it that's got the like the big couch throw of this, right? Over their couch. And it's like, this has just been like, oh, it's an album cover. It's a great album cover,
It's a
isn't it? Right.
beloved album cover now, but it's so evil looking, right? I
It's
mean, just think of how
incredibly
many
evil.
record stores were probably like wondering, God, should we carry this? Look at this. It's got the
Yeah.
666 and look at everything that's going on there. Yeah.
I mean, the guy has a snake wrapped around his neck.
Heck.
and yeah, everybody's naked, and yeah, there's the skull and the 666, and even just the 666 alone, like
Yeah.
how did that not cause trouble,
'Cause
right?
look at how much shit they got for Born Again, right? And that
Yeah,
was a decade before,
yeah.
or a decade
And
after.
it
Yeah.
probably rubs off on the fact that there's a lot of smart Sabbath fans who call this the greatest Sabbath album of all
Oh yeah,
time,
yeah, for
or
sure.
at least their favorite, right?
Yep,
Of them,
yep.
right? And without that album cover, I would argue that you'd have 18 to 20% less bloom or gleam on that album, because that album cover just does so much
It's
for the
it's
contents, I think. And then of
yeah,
course the back cover as well is amazing, with a completely different color palette, right?
yeah.
And it's kind of like a before and after picture. And yeah, it's just an incredible but very unsettling sort of album cover.
It's basically their greatest album cover, I would say. Or if it's
Yeah,
not, maybe with the first one, maybe Heaven and Hell, right? Mob
yeah,
Rules. Because a
yeah,
lot of those other album covers from the 70s are not all that great.
yeah. So it's Warner Brothers taking a risk, Vertigo, whatever. I mean, it's also Ernie Cefalu and Pacific Pioneer taking a risk. It's like, are we going to get fired for this, right?
Yeah.
But I'm sure the band saw it and just like loved it to death, right? It's pretty incredible. So okay, so that's my second one. My next one is a little more super along the lines, and it's kind of a known story, but the whole idea of Grateful Dead moving from Oxymoxa to the duo of these two albums,
Oh,
Earth
yeah, good choice.
Dead
Yep.
and American Beauty.
Yep.
And but the funny thing is getting ready for this episode, I took a good listen to Oxymoxa and the stuff after, and they didn't really change that much. There's a little less electric on the guitar, there's a little less arranging, there's a little less psychedelic keyboards and stuff like that. But they were pretty mellow and almost like Americana with their version of psych anyways. But these are considered, I think Jerry said something like you're getting the working man's version of the Grateful Dead here. And there was all kinds of trouble here with they were in legal troubles because of drug charges and stuff. They didn't have a lot of time, so they knocked these out very quickly. But people love the fact that they are changing, right? So people love a creative risk. They want their bands to be creative, and then now they've got this story, within the entire rest of the catalog, those murky early or middle years, and then you got the Donna and Keith years, and then the last couple of albums later on. So it's people love the fact that they have something to talk about where there are peaks and valleys going on. It's a little bit like the Metallica story, except with Metallica, it's only the productions. I don't think any of their albums take a particular risk anywhere. I literally went through the entire Metallica album for this episode and thought, did they take a single risk with their albums? They changed, but none of them really felt like a risk. But I think on a more micro level, they kind of took risks with their productions along the way, right? Which is kind of neat. But so yeah, that's my next one. People love these albums to death. It ended up with some of their biggest hits with Box of Rain and Uncle John's Band and all that kind of stuff. So people, it's a little bit the opposite of Bob Dylan going electric. This is Grateful Dead going acoustic, right? And more Americana. So there you go. That's my next three.
And meanwhile, those are my two least favorite Grateful Dead albums. See,
Oh yeah,
I don't like that period all that much. I don't hate it because there's some good songs there. It's just really laid back, kind of like that country blues thing they do. I prefer the more psychedelic earlier stuff and the stuff they did after. Because for me, like Terrapin Station, Blues for Allah, Mars Hotel, that's really my sweet spot for the Dead. Those three
yeah.
albums.
I'm Keith and Donna first, and then this era, and then the other eras. I
Gotcha.
don't I don't like that Wake of the Flood Blues for Allah era.
Oh,
And
really? Oh, I
I
love
love
that era.
Terrapin Station. I love Shakedown Street. Those are my two favorite. And then these two are my next two favorite. So it goes those two, and then those two, and then probably because I'm just a poser and I like my music accessible, I'd probably go for the last two, and even go to Heaven next before I'd go to any of that earlier stuff, except for this period, because this is light on the ears as well. I'm getting old, right? So there
It's
you go. Yeah,
amazing, right?
everything from Shakedown Street or Terrapin Shakedown era all
All
the
the way
way to
to
the
the end.
end, plus these two, and then the rest of it almost is dead to me. So
Wow.
yeah,
Okay. I mean, that's stuff I like the
yeah.
most.
I,
Yeah.
I didn't mean to make a pun there, but they are dead to me. Yeah.
All right, my next choice, little more of an obscure band, but how about when you are primarily known as an instrumental band, and then you decide to do an album that features vocals? That's taking a risk. The band is Earthless, and the album is Black Heaven. So this was their first album, and that they're on Nuclear Blast Records, right? So they're on a pretty big metal label, and you move away from doing what you're known for, which is doing these big, long, explosive, psychedelic stoner rock instrumental jams full of loads and loads of guitar solos and riffs and crazy drumming. I've often said that classic Earthless to me is basically an instrumental super group of Jimi Hendrix along with the rhythm section from Black Sabbath, Bill Ward and Geezer Butler. That's what their albums sound like to me. And now all of a sudden you're doing shorter songs with vocals, more typical stoner rock stuff, but it really works. They haven't gotten bad, and this is their God, what year did this come out in? 2018. So this is now, God, 7 years ago. I was going to say six, but we're in 2025. They have since gone back to their normal way of doing things, which is long instrumental jams, lots of guitar. But I think this is a really good album, and I think they proved to themselves that they could do this, that it would sound really good because it does. This is a very good album. Uh, if they ever decide that what they normally do, they've kind of gotten tired of, well, let's go back and do more conventional 3 to 5 minute songs with vocals, punchier arrangements, less long jams. And it's a triumph for me. Again, it's a deviation from what they normally do, but it worked. Will they go back to it? I'm guessing they will at some point, but we'll see. All right, next up, how about a classic prog band that has moved into a new decade, changed their lineup a bit, embraced all the technology and the new sounds that are popping up all over the world, but still calling themselves Yes for 90125. They took a big chance here. Now, they originally were going to not be called Yes. It was not going to include John Anderson. This is basically Chris Squire, Alan White. They bring back Tony Kaye from the old days and a guy from South Africa called Trevor Rabin, multi-instrumentalist vocalist. And they were going to do something different. John Anderson started talking to them, and before you know it, they've got an album that is called Yes, but doesn't really sound like Yes. Again, it embraces early 80s pop. And certainly there's some new wave on here. Is there a little bit of prog? Yeah, there's a little bit of prog, but it's completely different. And in the process, they wound up opening up the Yes name and their music to millions and millions of people that probably never listened to Close to the Edge and Relayer and Tales from Topographic Oceans, and all of a sudden made prog rock appealing in the 80s alongside other bands like Asia, right, and whatnot, who were doing stuff that was in Rush, that were doing things that were really working. But yeah, 90125, huge risk, and to this day, their biggest selling album. And my last choice for this round is a band that decided on their third album that they were they were going to do a lot of these little folky bits that they kind of dropped in on their first two albums, and they didn't. They decided to do an album that was pretty much half all of that sort of thing. Led Zeppelin 3. All right, you do have a couple of hard rockers on here. You got a blues number. All the rest is folky stuff, acoustic based. I remember at the time, Martin, I was horrified when I first got this album, but this is a work of genius because I think one of the great things about Led Zeppelin, we've talked about it before, is how well-rounded they were as musicians and how well they did lots of different styles. Blues, heavy rock, proto metal, folk, blues rock, little bits of jazz, pop. They did it all. And the acoustic stuff on here is brilliant. The heavy rock stuff on here is brilliant. To this day now, I look at this album much, much different than I did back then. This is one of their great albums, of course, and gives you all the little bits that they do so well. I think they would expand on this with the album that you and I talk about all the time, Physical Graffiti, which takes these elements and more over two albums and shows you what Led Zeppelin is all about. But yeah, Led Zeppelin 3 is my final pick for this round.
Nice. All right. So my next one is Kiss Alive. So this
Aha.
is a risk in a number of ways.
Yep.
Number one, it's a risk for Casablanca even to be putting out another Kiss album. They're running out of money. Um, there's all this talk about Bill Aucoin. It's a little confusing, but is it Neil Bogart that mortgages his house? Is it Bill Aucoin that mortgages his house? Is it both of them, right? But yeah, they're running out of money. Everybody's they're silently, fighting and grousing about all this, and they're not getting big yet. But with Kiss Alive, it's a risk, A, like I say, for even putting out an album, B, putting out a double album, and C, putting out an album that is a gatefold with packaging and a booklet and all that stuff. So they're spending a lot of money to do this. So it's kind of a roll of the dice. What's going to happen? And obviously, it totally works for them. It's got one of the most iconic album covers of all time. Great live shot, right? This, of course, makes them look massive, right? And they're not really massive yet when this is happening. And I thought of future Kiss things, and I think, is Beth really a risk? Is I Was Made for Loving You really a risk? Is putting out the 4 solo albums really a risk, right? I don't think they're in the same category. This is almost like a do or die situation, sort of thing, because this is a feisty, smaller label. It's got some Warner Brothers backing and all that kind of stuff as well. But it is definitely a roll of the dice. How is this album going to do? And the other thing, the other reason they put out this album was they were absolutely spent. In terms of, they were literally spent in terms of all the money, but they were also spent in terms of writing songs. And as Bill Aucoin puts it, they pretty much literally couldn't afford to go into a studio. So that's why, the live album was almost like a necessity sort of thing. But yeah, big risk putting out a live. My next choice, I'm doing 4 here. My next choice is Ricky Gervais. I started thinking about these people who took a risk, and it's a very slim sort of situation. So take a risk by leaving the music industry and doing something else, sort of thing. Now, the doing something else is key here, and the way Ricky Gervais works is because he had back in 1983, even with London Records, he had this weird little dance duo called Siona Dancing, and they put out a couple of singles. He even went on to manage Suede later, but his story, he bounced around to a lot of jobs. So I picked him because this is someone leaving the industry, and eventually he takes a try at comedy, and now he's one of the richest, most successful, and a very good comedian, right? Kind of thing, right? But then I thought, who else kind of did this and took a risk? And I thought, Mutt Lange, as a musician, it's not really taking a risk going and being a producer. That's almost like the antithesis of taking a risk, right? And he's not successful. I mean, Ricky Gervais isn't successful either. And then I thought, is someone like you think of Greg Giuffria becoming a big businessman in the slot machine business and stuff, but that's not taking a risk either. It's like leaving a band that makes no money and has no success and goes on and does something that your parents probably told you should have done in the first place. Go into business, right? But then I thought of Dan Spitz and the whole Anthrax watchmaker story, right? Because Dan was in the band from 83, I think, to 95, something like that. So he's in a big, successful band. A band with starting to have a string of gold records and stuff, big working, well-respected thrash band. And he takes a risk. And now he's kind of known as this interesting story of a guy who becomes like a world-class watchmaker sort of thing, right? So he took a risk and left the industry to do something kind of remarkable that he's, he'll go into history with that interesting storyline sort of thing. So yeah, I found, I don't know who else is kind of like this. I started thinking of all the Hollywood actors who might have been musicians before. But, taking a risk, leaving a creative arts industry that you're failing at is not exactly taking a risk. Although leaving to go into acting is still considered at the same risk level, I suppose.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So that's my number 3. I got 2 more here. My next one is The Cult with Electric. Yep. This is a situation. It's pretty funny. This is a band that had a bunch of success, and they also had a bunch of street credibility for the hybrid, interesting guitar hero / gothic sound that got them their success. And they were about to make another album like this, or like Love. and you can hear that all in the Manor sessions of these songs, plus some other originals that didn't make the album. It's funny. You listen to the arrangements on them, and they're all that same sort of murky arrangement, big wet drums, guitar licks, guitar effects, um, and the riff isn't sort of emphasized as much. And then they get together with Rick Rubin. They're in New York. There's all this energy and vigor, and Rick Rubin just sort of challenges them. You want to make a really rockin' album sort of thing, and the guys kind of were talked into it. And all of a sudden, Rick Rubin strips down their sound to the point where they're making this Masters of Reality, AC/DC essentially kind of album, where it just hits you right between the eyes, like heavy Rolling Stones, even, which I guess is what AC/DC is in effect. But this is just so direct and shocking, and it was a huge success. And basically the hair metal or the headbanging crowds embraced them, and they didn't think they were posers for it. They were just happy they were doing it. And I don't know what the goth crowd thought of it. I actually don't have that answer, whether they were abandoned in droves by people who loved them as a post-punk band. I have no idea, but it basically marked their further ascendance. There was already excitement around this band with Love and She Sells Sanctuary and all that
I
anyway.
remember at the time, a lot of the early fans were not happy with that direction on that album.
Yeah.
I remember
Yeah.
talking to a lot of people who felt that way.
Yeah, so it was quite a shock, and I remember hearing it and going, why aren't more people talking about how shocking this is? But yeah, it was a huge success. And my final one is Rush with 2112, which is a funny sort of opposite of everything we're talking about here. So Rush took a risk by standing their ground and just doing what they were doing anyways, and continuing to make non-commercial music, and saying, we're right about this. This is what we want to be remembered for. If we crash in flames, we crash in flames. It's essentially it's even less commercial than Fly By Night. It's less commercial than Rush, and it might be equally commercial to Caress of Steel. It's just not very commercial in any way. One side of it is a concept album, and it's a real concept album where there's little soundtracky bits and short stuff and long stuff and mellow passages, and nothing really discerns comes out of it. And then the other side is pretty heavy and not very commercial songs at all. There's no reach out and give you a bear hug Fly By Night song on it, or a Closer to the Heart on it. So there's really nothing very commercial about it at all. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting way to say we took a risk. We took a risk by making no changes. Yeah. We're just going to make another album that's just kind of, shows us as better writers and better recorders than the last time around. But otherwise, we're just going to double down and do the same thing. And so, yeah, that's a different way of taking a risk. Just saying, if we lose our label deal, we lose our label deal. So there you go. That's my last one. Rush.
That's a great choice, because I've always felt that 2112 isn't all that much different than Caress of Steel. Caress of Steel gets so much shit from people, but everybody loves 2112. But 2112 is basically the same type of a concept as Caress of Steel, just maybe the songs are a little bit better, a little more memorable, right? There's really not that much. It's the same type of music. So, but it finally clicked with people, I guess.
Yeah.
Great choice. All right. How about a beloved, legendary jazz guy who decides, I'm going to do an album where we plug in and dabble in this rock thing that the rest of the world is doing? Miles Davis with In a Silent Way, which horrified longtime traditional jazz purists who heard this album and said, "Oh, electric piano, electric guitar. Oh, we don't want that on a jazz recording. What is Miles smoking over there? What is he doing?" Well, by doing this album, which basically is the birth of what we now call jazz rock or jazz fusion, Miles decided to bring aboard a bunch of people who could plug in. So we not one, but we got two electric piano guys. You got Herbie Hancock and Chick Corea on here. Sorry, we got three. and Joe Zawinul. You got John McLaughlin on electric guitar. You got Wayne Shorter. You got Tony Williams on drums. Dave Holland on bass. It's atmospheric. It's electric. It still is jazzy, but it's embracing this whole psychedelic movement that was happening at the time because, of course, this was what, 1967, I believe, something like 67, 68, something like that, one of those 2 years. And like I said, it's a beloved album now. It's looked at as the start of a movement. All these other Miles albums to come, as well as new bands by a lot of the guys that were in this band. You got John McLaughlin doing the Mahavishnu Orchestra, Tony Williams doing Lifetime, Joe Zawinul doing Weather Report, Chick Corea doing Return to Forever. You got Herbie Hancock doing his various different bands, embracing uh, electric instruments and new sounds. So yeah, highly influential album. Huge risk though, because this is a guy that sold lots and lots of records doing straight ahead acoustic jazz and bebop. This was something completely different. So maybe he lost some of the purists along the way, but gained a whole new audience in doing this. So there's that. The reason I got up before and ran over to the shelf, because while you were talking about Kiss Alive, it led me to think of what is probably the biggest risk-taking album in my entire list that I didn't think about till you were talking about that album. So, what other band would release as their debut album a double album wherein most of it is totally uncommercial and jammy and whatever? The Chicago Transit Authority. Yes, we're a brand new band. Here's our brand new debut album. It's a double album. There's 10-minute and 15-minute long songs on here. There's guitar jams on here. There's all sorts of horns. Yeah, we'll give you a couple singles while we're at it, but most of it is uncommercial as you could possibly imagine. And it wound up selling like a couple million copies, right? And not only did they do this, their second album was a double album. Their third album was a double album. Their fourth album was a quadruple live album. It wasn't until their fifth album they say, "All right, we'll give you a conventional 40-minute record. Here you go." And then I'll add another one here because, again, what other band would do this? So after they start releasing conventional albums after a while, they come back with album number seven. Oh, we're going to give you another double album, Chicago 7, and half of it's going to be all instrumental, abstract, avant-garde jazz with no vocals, and it still sold tons, right? Because of course they got a couple hits on here as well. So for me, Chicago early on were one of the biggest risk takers of any band on the planet because they just didn't give a fuck and they said, we're going to do what we're going to do. Yeah, we'll throw you some hit singles along the way, but we're going to put this weird jammy jazz rock, prog, soulful, whatever you want to call it, loaded with horns and unconventional this and that, and we're going to make it work. And they did, which is a shame that in the 80s they just became this kind of bland hit machine after so much great music in the 70s. But yeah, Chicago is my next pick, regardless what album you want to throw in there. But yeah. Releasing double albums so early in the career, not once, not twice, not three times, four times. Yeah, whatever. So
Nice.
that's my, and I think I got one more, right? Yeah. Okay.
I think you have
Let's,
two more, don't you? No, one more. Okay.
yeah, one more. Yeah, because I did Miles, Chicago, and now I'm going to go back to Rush
Okay.
because I think Signals is a big risk for them. I know they started with some different sounds and using different technology on moving pictures, but it still was very much in the style of Rush. I think with Signals embracing all these keyboards and synthesizers and toning down the guitar a bit, yeah, it still sounds like a Rush album, but again, this was a big risk to totally do a about face based on what everything had come before. And, as we've seen with Rush throughout the years, they kind of took these risks all along the way. And I think them constantly reinventing themselves and embracing technology and new instruments and new this and new that, new production styles. Again, it's the last one with Terry Brown. I almost picked Grace Under Pressure. You could pick any of the ones that came after as taking a big risk, but I think it all really starts here with let's shorten the songs. Let's make them less guitar oriented. Let's push the keyboards and the synthesizers up. Let's do a different type of production and see what happens. The world still loved it, so it worked. Maybe they lost some hardcore listeners along the way, certainly with some of the albums to follow, but I think the essence of Rush is, even in your example too, it still sounds like Rush, but here It's a very different style of Rush. Everything we heard on 2112, Caress of Steel, Hemispheres and whatnot, it's not really on this album. This is very, very different. The influence of the Police and all this other stuff, this new wave that's out there, pop music, but it works. And it's a beloved Rush album all these years later. So that's
Great.
my next to last one.
Nice. Well, I'm done. I could swear you've only done nine. I don't know. I've done
Oh, I
I've
have. I thought we were saving. Okay, yeah.
yeah.
Sorry. So you did four in your last one. All right. So yeah, my last one. I guess this is a good. Yeah, whatever. I'm gonna go with it. "Songs from the Wood" by Jethro Tull. So here's a band that throughout their career up to this point, this is, late 70s, mid 70s, had done this early on a blues band, then incorporating like a little bit of acoustic and blues rock, and then going full bore prog and heavy rock along the way. And then they decide with Songs from the Wood that we're going to fully embrace all of our little folk elements, and they wind up doing what is the first of three considered folk rock, folk prog classics, where there's loads and loads of acoustic instruments used. You not only the flute, you got acoustic guitar, you got mandolin, different types of tin whistles and things like that. Mixed in with their normal proggy stuff. There's a little bit of hard rock guitar on here, but took a chance, like really, really going full bore into this avenue, and it works wonderfully. And this has become like one of the most beloved albums in the catalog. And I think just a great idea for them to do this. And it works so well. And there's just one classic track after another on here. It still feels like Jethro Tull, maybe not as hard rocking, maybe not as bluesy, certainly, but the folk aspect of their style really worked well across a whole album here. So yeah, "Songs from the Wood," great album from Tull, the start of their little folk period there.
And the fans embraced it, right? They love that. They love
Love
heavy
it. Yeah,
horses. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
It really
So,
worked.
so these risks, like I say, I mean, I guess the theme of the show is that these risks pay off because they become albums that people love over the years. They grow on you. They make you cooler. They make the band cooler for taking these risks, sort of thing, right? I thought
Yeah,
it was a good show as well because it is the new year, right? First show of the new year, fresh start. A lot of this is about fresh starts for these guys, right?
yeah.
So,
You got any leftovers, honorable mentions?
well, Fleetwood Mac bringing in, Buckingham Nicks kind of thing, that
Yes.
whole do over. White Snake kind of, David Coverdale always risking things, I think, by firing members all the time, changing members constantly, trying to do new things, and then just the whole kind of makeover, embracing what John Kalodner tells him, and Geffen, and that whole move into the States, all of that. And then I thought Genesis Abacab is similar to the Rush situation with the adopting technology and that. So that's all I had.
Cool. I got a few. Death, the Sounds of Perseverance. So basically taking the death metal framework, but fully embracing a lot of the more progressive elements that they had been starting to incorporate earlier in the decade. While it's still death metal, this is really, really melodic. Chuck is using different vocal styles. It's less extreme, but they've amped up the musicality of its notches and notches and notches. Unfortunately, it would be their last album, but I think most people look at this as the really, really artistic death album. Deep Purple with Stormbringer, doing more the funk rock stuff, right? Funky things. Of course, it kind of pissed off Richie Blackmore, getting him to want to leave the band, but I think they took a risk. Other than the title track, which kicks off the album, the rest of it's really, really kind of different for them. A very, very different sounding album than even Burn. How about taking like, you know, a formula that a band had been using for many, many years, which is just basically Latin rock and jazz and whatnot, and saying, all right, we got to do something different because we're not selling any records. Why don't we just invite all sorts of current pop stars on our album, bring in different songwriters, and see how it works? Supernatural by Santana. I mean, it still sounds like a Santana album, but you got like a million guest stars on here and different songwriters, and this was an enormous, enormous album for them. Enormous album for Carlos and company. How about a hard rock guitar player? Again, entering into a new decade that decides that, you know what, I want to go back to my roots. I want to do something completely different. I'm tired of doing the hard rock and metal thing. Gary Moore still got the blues. Let's do a straight blues album. It is this biggest selling album ever. A prog band on their third album decides to embrace avant-garde jazz. King Crimson Lizard. It's weird. It's totally jazzy. It doesn't sound anything like the first two albums. It's still really, really good. Uh, a blues rock psychedelic guy who decided to embrace pop and jazz rock. Robin Trower, In City Dreams, the album right there. So all the big long guitar jams are kind of gone at this point, but the great vocals are there. It's smoother. It's definitely easy listening. Trower, really good. Here's one I thought you might come up with here, but Thin Lizzy, Thunder and Lightning. Let's go do a metal album. It's going to be our last album. We'll do the heaviest thing we ever did. I think this album works wonders. I think it's amazing. And I think as a last kind of gasp before they decide to retire, I think it works really, really well. And that's all I got.
Nice. It's funny. I was playing Long Misty Days and Victims of the Fury yesterday, and it's just every time I play Robin Trower, I go, man, I could listen to this guy all day,
All
right?
day long. Yep.
And it's just like it's just something about it just sounds authoritative and important, right? It just
Yeah.
sounds really weighty and deep, you know, what they get up to. It's so intense, right? That's another one I could have thrown on our retirement episode, right? It's like I
Yeah.
should be I could see 50% of my listening time being just the Robert Drower
He's
catalog.
got a shit ton of albums for
Yeah,
one.
I just love
Uh,
it. I don't think about him enough, right? It's
yeah.
just really weird. And when I do, it's like this is the greatest thing ever.
What do you think of that voice? Because I think Jimmy Dore
Oh,
was one of the
I
great
know.
singers of the
Oh,
70s.
that's a huge part of it as well, right?
Yeah.
It just the whole and just marrying that voice to that music is just genius itself. They just seem to go together so well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
great stuff.
I love the classic Robin Trout. I mean, you mentioned Victims of the Fury. Oh, what a powerhouse album that was. I mean, and it still is to this day. And I think Long Misty Days is really underrated as well. I like that one quite a bit. Yeah, the whole catalog is a lot of interesting things. But I think, one of the things that has not soured me, but one of the reasons why I find like a lot of his more recent albums less interesting is because I grew up with Robin Trower with that voice. And even when he had Davy Pattison on vocals, that's still another great singer. And when he decided to say, I'm just going to I'm going to do the vocals myself, it just doesn't work. So, I mean, he's just not a great vocalist at all. I wouldn't even say he's a really good singer. But to me, you got to have that wonderful guitar paired with a really, really strong singer. That's what
Yeah,
makes Robin Trower so good. So,
yeah,
yeah.
wicked. Yeah, cool.
All right, Martin, what's going on with the Contrarians and new books and podcasts and things?
Yeah, no new books really recently, but anything that is available is at martinpopoff.com. I'm selling a lot of the Hawkwind visual biography lately for some reason. I don't know why, but the
Oh
Judas
yeah.
Priest is still doing really well. The Judas Priest album by album, the more recent one, and the Genesis ones. Contrarians, I'm still doing that series, reliving old reviews as a useless tool of confusion. Motorhead one went up yesterday. A Shanker, a Man of War recently. We got more coming to that. We're going to be doing our album cover show as well. And I still have my audio podcast on episode 288 now, History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff, straight audio, half an hour every episode. So that's going as well. Plus Kicked in the Teeth with John Gaffney. So
Right.
the
That's right.
usual stuff.
That's right. Speaking of Mr. Gaffney, I need to get in touch with him because we have a Ullman ranking the albums episode to do in the not too distant future. So
Nice.
yeah, so I need to circle back with him. So cool. That's a wrap for another episode here, folks. Tune in a couple hours. We got the professor's picks coming up at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time today. Some cool new releases coming out. That's right. It's January. Saying goodbye to saying goodbye to 2024 stuff and hello to 2025 stuff. I say that and I sit here and look at a stack of at least 15 albums from last year that I haven't reviewed yet because I planned on doing it while I was off for the holidays, but because I got sick, I didn't listen to anything. So I'm like, all right, so here we go. Once again, starting off the new year, playing catch up to 2024. Never fails. No matter how hard I plan it, Martin, it never fails. It just never works out that way. So you'll be getting more late 2024 reviews over the next couple weeks. That'll be happening here. We got Jamie Laszlo on the review crew coming up tomorrow. And then Sunday, I will be ranking the albums of the great Dutch prog band Trace. That's coming up on Sunday. So till then, visit us on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Facebook. We're on YouTube all together all the damn time. Please subscribe if you haven't already and click on that notification bell so you get alert of all of our content as a post. And please, please hit the like button before you leave so YouTube sends this out into the algorithm. More likes, the more we get introduced to new viewers. That's what it's all about. We love you viewers, but we want new viewers. So, hit that like button, please. And we'll see you back here in 2 weeks here at the Fun House. For Martin Popoff, I am Pete Pardo. Enjoy your Friday and your weekend, and we'll see you real soon. Take care. Bye bye.